On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Joe Emison. He is the CTO and co-founder at Branch Insurance. We're going to be talking about cheaper, faster, better within software development. Joe has a book that we're going to talk about, but more importantly, we're going to talk about his views on how software should be made cheaper, faster, and better, which always don't go well together. We're going to touch on his team, how they develop and how they produce a lot of effective and substantial amount of code with a smaller team. And we're going to talk about value streams. We're going to talk about being aligned to the right stakeholders and defining the stakeholders correctly. And we're going to try to fit in as much as we can. I don't know. Joe's got a great background. He can talk about anything and everything, but I think this is a passion, and I'm excited to have you on, Joe. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Branch, before we dive in, I want to try to cover as much as we can, but tell us what the company does. Make sure everyone has a little context of your background.
Branch is a full stack insurance company. We sell home, auto, renters, umbrella, condo, and we're in 36 states plus Washington, D.C., and we hold the risk. So we're not just an agent. Like we pay the claims, administer the claims, and everything. And Branch is my sixth company as a CTO and co-founder. And then I've also been acquired into several companies and done digital transformations and been a consulting CIO, CTO as well.
Awesome. All right. So I know, and just to kind of preface this, I know before we hit record, we talked about this topic, and you'd mentioned a book you've written, Serverless as a Game Changer. And I think it was an interesting discussion point because it led to the idea of better, cheaper, faster within software development, that serverless mindset. Can you just start off and introduce us to that concept of leveraging that serverless mindset in modern software development?
Yeah, and I think probably the best way to do is to start with analogies that most people who work in software development agree with, and then extend them to where I live today, which is where most people in software development do not agree with, in my experience, but it is still true. So I think everybody can agree that we've made huge gains in how we can build things cheaper, faster, and better over time. And one good example of this would be Twilio for text messages. So if we wanted to send text messages or run our own IVR, and I actually did this, I bought a machine with telephony cards and built an IVR around 1999. And even then, I thought we had great technology there, but that was a pain in the butt. And what I can do today with Twilio is cheaper, faster, and better than how I built that IVR more than 20 years ago. And so this idea then that we can use managed services to do things that we previously had to do ourselves, it enables us to do things cheaper, faster, and better. So it's cheaper because we're using a service we are multi-tenant on, and we are only paying for what we are using of that service. Now, there are always these edge cases where it's not cheaper if at scale you're doing such a huge volume that you could do it yourself. But for example, with Twilio, it's very hard to get to a volume in which you should want to do it yourself. And in fact, if you're Uber, you're doing a lot of text messages and you're still not setting up your own telephony cards. But engineers always want to say, no, it could get really, really big and then it would be really expensive. And they're all like sorts of examples of, well, I use this service and it got really expensive. But, in general, in the normal case, these things are cheaper because you're paying per use or multi-tenant. It's faster because that system is already set up for you. It's well documented. There are a lot of people using it. It's been really tested, so you didn't have to build it and discover its idiosyncrasies. And it's better because you don't have to write all this code you have to maintain. You don't have to build these systems you have to maintain. And code is a liability, not an asset. Having to maintain things adds cost, pain, difficulty. It's a lot easier to maintain something that's 100 lines of code than is 100 million lines of code. And so, you get cheaper, faster, and better when you use these services. But the big thing, that I talk about in my book here, Serverless as a Game Changer, is that you can build entire applications this way. And some good examples of this are like Firebase at Google, or AWS has AppSync, or the Amplify libraries. There's Supabase. There are all of these, and the original Parsons Firebase. There are all these ways of building complete applications on managed services and tying other managed services into them. And what we've done at Branch is built an entire full stack regulated insurance company's policy administration system this way. And we've done it with 1/30th the number of people that other startups who are venture backed, who built their own insurance, full stack insurance companies over that same time period. We built it in less time. We built it for more insurance products. And so we have great proof points that we, in fact, did it cheaper, faster, and better. And it makes sense why it's cheaper, faster, and better.
I think when we talked about this, and you kind of gave me some of the makeup of the team and 1/30th of the size, and it was very impressive. And before we dive in there, I guess let's maybe touch on the cheaper, faster, better side, right? You'd said something very interesting that kind of ties into a lot of what you just said. You'd mentioned that within the software development industry, there's very little continuing education. And a lot of what I just heard you talk about are technologies that have emerged, that are emerging, that you need to be aware of to be able to fully leverage. Otherwise, it puts you in a little bit difficult spot. Maybe touch on, some of that side of, to get to faster, cheaper, better within software development. Where does that tie to continuing education come in?
In software development, we generally have the following things. One of them is there is continual improvement in tooling and managed services and how you can build software. I think everyone would agree that the way we build software today, the way we believe is the right way to build software today, is dramatically different from 20 years ago. I would argue that the best way to build software today is dramatically different than 3 years ago. And I could give examples. But certainly, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it's might as well be a different profession. So that is true. And anyone who disagrees with this, I would submit, just isn't looking at the ways that modern software is getting built. In my book, I talk a lot about how Instagram, when it sold for $1 billion, had only 13 employees. And they weren't all software developers. And so it's you've got other examples of like single developer startups that scale massively and get a lot of adoption. And so anyone who's like, no, you couldn't do it, you'd have to do these things, you should be a bit more skeptical of yourself and look into this. But another thing that's true in software development is that most of the leadership in software development is, say, 20 plus years out of their first software development work, out of doing more independent software development work where they would have been discovering the latest and greatest things. And so what I see is a lot of VPs of engineering, a lot of CTOs, a lot of lead developers who don't have any sort of continuing education strategy, don't learn new things, get rewarded for delivering the way that they always have, and then generally, are very dismissive of new technologies because they'll spend 5 minutes looking at them and go, oh, that must not be any better, and I don't know it. And so the only way to get the advantage of these improvements in technology and these new ways of building more effectively is if you really are willing to say all the time, maybe what brought me here isn't the best thing to take me forward from here. And that's hard. And it's especially hard to do when you are compensated by and bonused by not doing that, right? You won't, in the short term, you won't be rewarded for learning those things. Only in the long term will that matter. And so lots of people are much more content to sit on, well, I know a way to do it, and it's worked for me this far, and so I'm just not going to learn anything new.
I'm going to come back to the essence of this with a follow-up question, but you got me thinking about something. When it comes to CEOs, more experience typically helps, right? I rarely hear of a less experienced CEO not having seen different situations. Obviously, there's benefits of being less experienced, but in general, people go, well, if you're going to be a CEO of let's say, a larger company, having seen different situations, it's a good thing. With a CTO or a VP of engineering that is being removed from technology, maybe, like you said, maybe it's 10 years, 15 years last time they were, in the weeds. They like to stay up. They like to stay current. They've moved into more of a people business manager environment. Is it actually hurting people to become less hands-on? Because I mean, everything you just said sounds like, well, to take advantage of these technologies, you really need to be dialed in. Maybe my team is, but they have to bubble up that information to me, and we have to make a decision. So I am being guided by the people I trust, the people I hired, but maybe fundamentally, I actually don't know how to weigh the value of that information because I just haven't been in that development environment. I mean, that's a difficult question. I don't want to put you out there and on a limb to answer it, but I'm curious.
I think it's a great question. I would describe it this way because it's certainly different organizations are set up different ways. You have and there is not a one size fits all way to think about how to organize your company. I'm a big believer in you optimize for people's strengths, not trying to find and you identify the strengths of your team, and then that's how you organize around. And so I don't. A given CTO, a given CIO, a given VP engineering, I don't know. But here's what I can say. The situation you are trying to avoid, and this is as a CTO or CIO, I think it is incumbent on you to avoid this situation and make sure your organization is set up properly for it, is where there are critical decisions being made that have really significant business or organizational impacts, but that are being made by someone in the organization who is either ignorant of good alternative options or potentially worse, is optimizing for their own desire to do something. So sometimes that's like, try something new. Right. I mean, I am not advocating for you should try every new thing in the world. Like I like the Dan McKinley piece on use boring technology. In general, within Branch, we had a lot of experience using a lot of these managed services. And so we actually fit into the use boring technology because we had all those experiences. And I do think you could have an organization where you're like, well, maybe this other set of technologies would be cheaper, faster, and better. But like, we have 200 developers who don't know any of them. And like, it's not a good choice for us. Like all of those are very reasonable decisions to make, but you need to make sure, as a company, that you're not empowering somebody on the org chart to make some really consequential decision that nobody else above them has the technical ability to review whether it makes any sense. And so I've seen this, I mean, really in every organization I've ever come into as a consulting CIO or CTO, there are multiple decisions that were made that had impacts from single-digit millions to hundreds of millions of dollars of negative impact on the business's bottom line, usually made by either a CTO who is so far out of any sort of hands-on decision and cargo culted something that it was read, or made by a fairly young, talented person who was not aware of all of the options and was just making a poor choice. And so, I'll just add on to this that, if you're in an existing organization with a lot of existing custom software development that's going on, the number one thing you should be doing is adopting the DORA metrics from Accelerate, and you should be getting to, releasing multiple times a week. So if you're not doing that, I consult for a number of organizations. And so like my step one is always, you need to get the DORA metrics in place, and you need to be shipping multiple times a week. You need effective automated testing and CI/CD. Like that's step one. When I look at serverless as cheaper, faster, and better, a lot of times it comes into play mostly for greenfield development or like really substantial additional development. If you've got a lot of infrastructure on existing technology, there isn't like a great migration path a lot of time, but a lot of times there are good paths for, we've got this whole chunk of our application that we custom wrote and it's 2 million lines of code, but there's a service that we could use. And with a month of work, we could just delete all that code and we could use this other service instead. Those are the things that are magical. And but a lot of companies culturally will go, well, that's our IP, that's our magic. We need to keep that. That's valuable. And that's a cultural shift to understand that that's actually all liability right there.
Are you aligned to, philosophically, as a left field question, but curiosity now, the concept of tech debt comes up a lot. And, obviously we don't want to, we can define it. Everyone has their own understanding of tech debt, but just out of curiosity, when you think about what you just mentioned about leveraging a managed service, it's not your IP. Is there a notion of better, cheaper, faster aligns well with tech debt? Because it might just be cheaper to rip out and rewrite versus worrying about maintaining, because decisions change, technology shifts, people's understandings and capabilities in org shifts. Just curiosity, what your thoughts are there.
So Branch is the sixth company I started. Branch in terms of its users and total revenue and total volume is the most of any of the companies that I've ever started. And Branch has the least technical debt of any of them. And a huge part of that, Branch does not have significant, nor has it ever had significant technical debt. But the main thing, there's this promise of microservices, which actually turns out to be a lie a lot of the time, right? But the promise of microservices is like, break your application into smaller pieces, and it'll be easy to fix and replace them. That's a lie in terms of, it's a theoretical truth, but in reality, it tends to not be true because people can't implement them effectively. But the cool thing about implementing with using a lot of managed services is you actually do get that benefit, because if you build your application using a lot of services that third parties run, they run them, they're well documented, they have clean APIs, they're doing good change management on how they're making changes to their service and adding features. If you've got them as partners, then it turns out that your application will be amazingly modular and simple because you will have already broken it into all of these pieces that are in other places. You will already have these great abstraction points that are well defined and well made, as opposed to poor abstractions which kill you. So if you use a lot of these managed services, you're already getting like good, well thought out abstractions on how to use these services and how to separate your application. And so at Branch, we have routinely replaced these services that we use. We do it all the time. I would say every year we probably replace like 5 or 6 services with competitors or other things. It lets us pay less. It lets us, adopt, new feature sets that come out. And we've had cases where we have had a service and decided we wanted to build our own and bring it into custom code. And so we did that. And we've had cases where we had custom code and we decided to, exactly as you said, throw it all out and use a service for it. And those have been very easy processes for us because of the mentality of, we're largely connecting these services together, and we have a hub set of code that's very much about managing those calls and not about a ton of, really complex, undifferentiated logic.
You mentioned, worrying about writing a piece of code that's your IP. I guess when you'd mentioned about working on differentiated value streams, and I'll have you tell us what that means within this context, but helping the business focus on actual code that supports the business and its IP. Do we get that confused sometimes? Do we get too wrapped up in, hey, this code is going to be valuable towards the company? Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we absolutely do. And companies that are like rewarding people for the number of lines of code are just making a terrible mistake. The value of a business, in my experience, is the experience you're able to create, and all of the deep knowledge and understanding that goes behind creating that lovely experience, and then all of the customers you have as a result of that, customers, partners, et cetera, that you have as a result of having created that wonderful experience. Like, that's the value. And so if you can achieve that with less code and more of these managed services, like, just imagine two companies, one company that's achieving it with like very little code and using a lot of managed services, and one company that's doing it all with custom code. Like, which one would you want to buy? Which one sounds like it would be cheaper to operate? Which one sounds like, it would be more fun to work in? I mean, it's like being on easy mode.
I like the way you put that, because I think as we've been talking about this, and I have people at companies that are going through digital transformations, people at companies that are startups and building product. A lot of times I hear the struggles of finding people with the right skills to come help them. And sometimes it's like, well, maybe that's not your problem, right? And obviously you don't want to simplify the problems, but sometimes you wonder if the understanding of that business to technology translation to reduce that friction, make it less valuable, kind of in the context we're talking about now, make sure that we are focused on the thing that's going to stand up for the next 24 to 36 months, because it might not matter. Everything you've told me, I'm starting to think, you know what? Code is disposable. Maybe code isn't as valuable. Maybe we do need to rewrite and throw out. Maybe we need to be a little bit more API modular driven. I guess when you think about like any phase company, could be startup, could be a digital transformation at a Fortune 500 company, is there a mindset to embrace change in code so that we're not beholden to the existing code that's there?
I mean, I certainly think so. I'm a big believer in not giving the systems you write like cute names, or like celebrating them as, their things. So like there are some venture-backed insurance companies that, built their own back-end systems and entered them into competitions and like had cute names for them. And, the names for our systems are like, quote, staff, mobile, account, and that's intentional, right? Because I want to be able to throw them away, and I don't want them to be like a pet. I don't want people to have an identity around. I think that there are a lot of cultural things. I think there are compensation things that can be done. And one other thing I think that is just true about how you started your question is that if you have developers who can be as close as possible to the problem, or technical people at all, who are as close as possible to the people with the problem that you're trying to solve, right? If that gap is very small, then you will work cheaper, faster, better with those in getting those things done. But if the requirement to solve the problem is like the person talks to the person with a problem, and then that goes to like somebody else who writes something, and then there's a front-end developer, and an API developer, and a back-end developer, and a database developer, and then there's obviously the person who's running Kubernetes, who's having to do the container deployment in this way, then the security person has to do these deploys, et cetera, et cetera. As soon as you have that kind of fan out in order to solve the problem, you've just made everything, everything's more expensive. You got way more people, right? Everything's going to be way slower. And your number of cycles is going to be, way too slow. I mean, if you want to solve problems, real problems in the world with software, we know that the way to do this is you build something small, you get in there in the hands of the person who's got the problem, you watch it, and you cycle. And maybe it takes 50 cycles, maybe it takes 75 cycles, but you need that feedback, because no one can design software from their head, like right off the bat. Like, you got to do that testing and iteration. And so if your setup, and this again is why I emphasize the DORA metrics so much, if your setup means you get a cycle every 2 weeks or every month, and my setup means I get a cycle every day, I'm just going to crush you. I mean, I can have 4 orders of magnitude less money than you. It will not matter. I will run circles around you because I can do that. And so anything you can do to like limit the amount of stuff that your employees have to manage and do in order to build. And I will promise you that outsourcing lots of software development, lots of uptime, lots of security to managed service vendors is a really good way to do that, right? And I do give this example a lot too. I ask, sometimes when people are like, you're just wrong, you can't just stitch a bunch of APIs together, you can't build things properly that way, this would never work in a large, whatever the standard objections I hear from people are. But a lot of times what I'll ask is, okay, let's say you were selling like merchandise, right? Would you want to build your own like back end and front end and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Like, would you recommend that? Or would you say like, why don't you just go to Shopify and open a storefront? And they're like, well, I would just go to Shopify. I was like, well, why is that different? Like, well, you don't understand. Like that's sort of a commodity thing. In reality, what we're doing is this thing that's really special to our business. And I'm like, okay, I agree. But that thing that's special to your business has a lot of components. You could break it into a lot of components. And a lot of those components are very commoditized in the same way. You want to send email to people, you want to send text messages to people, you want to like run code in the back end, you want to like, scale a database, like those are commodity services today. And so you can make so instead of thinking like either it's like the whole thing has to be commodity and I can do Shopify, or at least one part of it's not commodity and special to our business, so therefore I have to build the whole damn thing. Like, no. One thing special, build that thing. Don't build anything else. So the more that people can have that mental image of everything that I'm writing that is something that some other company would use, I probably don't need to be writing, and I should probably be seeking to like get rid of that as soon as possible.
I love it, Joe. I love the viewpoint. I love the notion of really focus down on, I think what you were talking about, focus down on what's really important to the business. I think that's a great way to end the show, because I think that's the big takeaway as I'm listening to you, is I'm like, man, more people need to really understand that value to their business and actually just go build that. And I know you got to get back to running branch, so I appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing. If somebody wants to reach out to you to kind of, continue discussion, obviously we'll link to your book as well. It'd probably be a great starting point to learn a little bit more about your thoughts on software development in general. But what's a good way of connecting with you?
Joe Emison on the service formerly known as Twitter.
Okay.
While that's still alive. I'm also on LinkedIn, but that's even worse. So.
All right. Well, we'll include some links. We'll link to the book. Again, thank you for being on. Thank you for sharing great content.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a great conversation. Absolutely.
That's it for the episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, better, cheaper, faster. When Joe first mentioned that, I thought that was a great title for an episode to talk about how to actually take advantage of the modernization of the software development process to actually see how do people make code and production level code cheaper, faster, better. Obviously, at Branch, Joe's doing it. 6-time founder. He's exited. He's seen a lot, and he's an author as well. So I'm going to link to his book. Take a look at his book. It's fantastic. Hopefully you can use this episode, share with somebody else who might be interested in learning a little bit more about what Joe's been talking about. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.